Welcome to this lesson, Classes and IDs. HTML classes and HTML IDs. We are going to be taking a look at what these are and how these are used. So, an HTML class attribute is used to specify a class name for an element, or it could be used to specify for multiple elements. And what this does is that it can be used by your style or your CSS to style these elements, or by JavaScript to manipulate these elements that have the specific class name. The HTML ID attribute is used to specify a unique ID for an element. And I forgot to put an element there, but yeah, for an element. And it cannot be used for multiple elements. It's unique to a single element. And this can be used by both CSS and JavaScript, right? And CSS uses this to style the unique elements differently, right? And JavaScript also uses the ID to manipulate the element that has that specific ID. So we'll take an example of each so that we can understand what is going on here. So let's take a look at an example. So I'm going to put a comment here and say we are going to be looking at the class attribute. Okay, so let's have our HTML. Let's start with the doc type. Let's make that capital. Doc type HTML, and let's have our HTML, and then let's have our head, right? And then what do we have? Can anybody tell us? Let's have our body. Sorry, let's have our body, right? And in the body, let's have a couple of divs, right? So a div is like a container. So let's have a container div. Let's have about three of these. Or let's make it one first. And the first div, I'm gonna put in a header and say this. Let's just put in foods that we like, right? So breakfast, right? And then a paragraph, right? Saying maybe this is breakfast. So hard to find things to write, but we'll make it work, right? So I'm gonna create two more divs for lunch and dinner. I'm gonna say this is lunch, and then this is dinner. So lunch and then dinner, right? Okay, so we have three divs, and if I refresh it, you can see how it looks like, right? So what I'm gonna do is that we are gonna be looking at the class, right? And the class attribute, we're gonna associate it to the divs, right? So I'm gonna have a div, and I'm gonna have a class, and I'm gonna name it uh food, right? And I'm gonna put this same class name, or let's just keep this class name as food, right? If I refresh this, nothing happens because we are not doing anything with the class. So let's try and do something with this class. So let's style this uh, div class called food in our style section of our head. So in the head, we discussed this in previous lessons. We can have the style, right? And then we can have the style that we want to put in there. So to style a class, right, the format is to put a dot to signify that we are styling a class, and then the name of the class that we want to style. So in this case, it's going to be food. And then we are going to have the usual format, and then we're going to style it. So we're going to have, let's say, background color as tomato, right? And then maybe the color of the text. So we're going to say color, and I'm going to put in there which color contrasts well with tomato. I'm going to say white. And then let's put like a border, right? Let's say we want a 2 pixel solid and then black. So this is our border. And let's put a margin. And if you haven't watched the previous lessons, this is the best time to go back and look at all these that we are talking about. Let's say 30 pixels. And then padding of say 20 pixels. Okay, so if I refresh this now, you can see that the food style that we put as a class. Oh, sorry. The food class is what we styled, and that's why only the first div, which had the food class, had the style. So you can see it's breakfast, and this is breakfast being the only one that is styled. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I wanted to style the sorry, if I wanted to style the second div, all I need to do is to associate the same class to the div, right? So I'm going to put in there food. So I'm saying that, okay, give me the same style for this div also. So if I click it, voila, the style also worked for the second div. So that's how we use classes to style uh, blocks of elements or divs or whatever. If it's even inline or block elements, you can use the class to style it. So let me just emphasize that it's not only for block elements. So uh, I'm gonna do an inline here, right? So I'm gonna put a span, uh, span, and then let me just put the lunch, only the lunch, right? Maybe I did not copy this right, but okay. So I have this span, right? And it's only for the lunch, and I wanna style it differently. So if I have a class and I call this uh let's call this afternoon food, or let's call it afternoon, right? So I have this span and I call it afternoon, and it's only for the span element, right? So if I come back to the style, I could just say dot for the class and what afternoon for the class name, and then in here I can put some style. I can say maybe let's change the font size to 110%, right? And then let's make the color uh let's say yellow green, right? So I have this, right? So if I refresh this, you can see that the font size increased and then the color is color green. So you can use the class on both uh, inline also and your block, right? So that was what I wanted to show you guys, right? One more thing that can we can do is looking at the syntax for the class, right? So generally speaking, we should have the dots, right? You need to put in the dot, which signifies the class. That is, you're gonna style a class, and then you have your curly braces, right? And then you put in the the styles that you want to use, as we have identified, right? So, and again, we also talked about the fact that we can use the same for multiple uh, elements. You can also have multiple classes, right? So like you can also see that we had a class called afternoon and a class called food, right? So you can specify multiple classes for different elements, right? And again, different elements can share the same class, right? And it's gonna inherit the same styles that you put in there, right? We can use JavaScript to access or modify our DOM, change stuff, and we'll talk about that later when we look at JavaScript. But for now, we are just gonna ignore because I don't want us to start talking about JavaScript now. So just keep in mind that we can also do that for JavaScript, right? So in summary, we can have class attributes to specify one or more names for an element, and we can use the CSS and JavaScript to select, access, style, modify, whatever, right? And if we come to JavaScript, you're going to look at how we can actually do that. So let's look at the ID part of this. So the ID attribute specifies a unique ID for the HTML element, right? And it's unique because we cannot use it for multiple elements like what we did for the class, right? And again, the only other difference is that instead of the dot, it uses the pound or the hash, right? So we are going to look at an example of that. So in the same example, right? For this last div that we have here, I'm going to use an ID, right? So instead of using a class, I'm going to say ID is equal to uh, evening, right? And then that's it, right? And maybe I can say, okay, let's just do this for now, right? So now that we have put on our ID, we can now style our ID. So I go back to my style section, right? And here, instead of using the dots, I use what? Hash. And hash, and then I put in the name of the ID, which is evening, right? And you have your curly braces, and then we are going to style this differently. So I'm going to have my background color, just so we can see the difference. I'm going to choose something else, and I'm going to say color for the text. I want it to be what goes very well with this. I don't know, but we will just choose maybe this. And what else? Padding. Let's pad it up a little bit and say 40 pixel. And then let's align this. Um, center. Let's center this. Okay. So we have this, right? So if I refresh this now, you can see that this last div had a different style because we used an ID and then we targeted the ID and then we styled it differently. So that is the difference between the class and the ID, right? The class can be used for multiple elements, but the ID is unique for only one element within the page, right? And so if you're looking to style multiple elements the same way, you have to select class. If you are looking to style, if one element is unique, it's gonna have you can use the ID. So that is the difference. Uh, we can also use HTML bookmarks and IDs and links, well, with IDs and links. And we can look at that next. So what we mean by that is uh, bookmarks allow readers to jump to specific parts of a web page, right? Or a different page, but a specific part. So to use a bookmark, first of all, you have to create it, and then you have to add it. Uh, you have to add a link to it, right? Then when the user clicks it, the page will scroll to the location of the bookmark. So just as a simple uh, example, maybe I can put another paragraph here and put some lorem stuff here. Okay, so just refreshing it, this is what you get, right? So the first thing is to put like this. So let's put an ID here called ID equal to uh, jump. Sorry. Okay, so jump, right? And then let's say you wanted to jump to uh, this second section, right? Here. You can have your A here, your A tag, which is your anchor tag, and put in your href, and then in your href, what you do is you put in your hash or your pound, and then the name of the ID, which was what? Jump, right? And then it creates that link, right? So let's say I put in just got this and just put this one here. Okay, so if I refresh this, you have this, right? So you can see here that this is the link. It shows you the lorem, right? And you're able to jump to that, right? So it's the same page, it's the same, so you don't really see it, but it gives you that ID, right? So that's how we create bookmarks and IDs, so you can allows you to jump to specific parts of a page, right? So this is the section that only talked about how we can use IDs and how we can use classes to select elements, specific elements, group of elements, style it differently, and allow us to use JavaScript to manipulate specific parts of it. So we're going to look at the JavaScript later down the line. We're going to come back to this when we talk about that. So thanks for watching this lesson. See you in the next lesson. Thank you.